Have you ever needed a particular signature structure or model for a scene on your layout, but it just wasn't commercially available? Well, that's exactly my situation in Hodge Junction, and that's why I built this unique old sanding tower from scratch, and I'll show you exactly how I did it on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you saw my recent video of how I expanded my little interchange yard at Hodge Junction, you know that I needed a few signature details in order to make that yard look prototypical and represent the actual Hodge Junction in the real world. Well, one of the key identifiable structures in that yard in the time period that I model was this unique old sanding tower. Now, there's nothing like this that I could find commercially available in scale, but I knew that this would be a fairly easy scratch build project, so that's exactly what we're going to do today. Now, if you didn't see that previous video of how I built out Hodge Junction for interchange in my layout, you'll want to check that out, so I'll link it at an end screen at the end of this video. But with that said, let's head on over to the workbench and build this sanding tower. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. With 15,000 square feet of inventory and one-day shipping, whether in person or online, they are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. This is my model of Hodge Junction as we left it in the previous video. This yard looks quite different today, but in the time period I model, in the early 2000s, this yard was pretty old looking and had a lot of old junk and old structures. Here is an old overhead shot of part of the yard from the time period that I model. Though it isn't a very good picture, you can still see here the old sanding tower. It no longer exists today. I took this photo in 2003, and by that time the sanding tower was no longer in use. In fact, you can see here the foundation of the old sand house, which was no longer standing, but the tower itself still stood and was the most recognizable structure in the yard, so I needed a model of it. I had the photo, but I had no dimensions, so I had to approximate everything as I built it. I started by taking some measurements of a locomotive on a section of track to get the general dimensions, making dimensional notes and a rough sketch in a notebook as I went. I then used some graph paper to create a scale line drawing of the project. This turned out to be incredibly useful. Now, I'm building a model to represent the prototype tower, not an actual model of the tower itself. So for the legs, I decided to use these truss sections from Plastruct. They look slightly differently, but similar to those on the actual sanding tower. I'll include a parts list in my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below if you would find that helpful and like to check it out. I started to use the same trusses as the supports for the platform, but later decided to go with angle stock instead. I set a stop on my chopper to cut the legs to equal length. I used channel stock to create tie braces between the pairs of legs on each side, similar to the prototype. I also used angle stock to create head blocks on the tops of the legs, as well as bracing. I did nearly all of the gluing on this project with solvent cement. When I work with solvent cement, I like to work on a piece of waxed paper or parchment paper to avoid cementing plastic parts to my cutting mat. For all of this project, I'm using homemade solvent cement made with MEK with some bits of scrap styrene dissolved in it to act as filler. I began assembly by constructing each of the set of legs for the two sides. I used a scrap of 10,000 styrene for a base, cemented the legs to that base, then cemented the angle stock headers on the top of each leg and attached them together with the channel stock connectors. I repeated this project for both leg assemblies. I then allowed this cement to cure. Working on a piece of painter's tape mounted upside down, I set the distance between the two leg assemblies, then cemented the angle stock platform supports to the top. I used a scrap of 10,000 styrene to cut the platform floor and cemented it in place. I installed 4 angle stock braces per the prototype for rigidity. I considered a number of different items for the sandhopper, but this soda straw looked to be the best match for size that I could find proportionally according to my reference photo. I just cut it to a length that looked right. I cemented the end of the hopper onto a scrap of 10,000 styrene and held it while it set. Be careful here, as straws are made from a different type of plastic and do not weld as well to styrene with the solvent cement, but with care and patience you can make this process work. I let that cement cure completely as well, then cut the styrene around the straw and sanded it round and smooth, then cemented the hopper to the platform. Let me pause here to say that if you find this video interesting and would like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build your dream layout, then be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. For the upper rigid parts of the filler pipes, I used 2 different processes. For one, I softened styrene rod over a candle to bend it into sharp angles. Warning: make sure that your solvent cement and any other flammable products are completely removed from your workbench before using any kind of flame. This process worked okay, but my second idea worked far better. That was to use brass wire and bend it to shape using needle nose pliers. Generally, both of these pipes would work, so I used them both. When painted, you won't really tell the difference. I glued these to the bottom of the platform, using CA to glue the brass wire to the joint. I used the same size styrene rod for the intake pipe, which extends from the sand house to the top of the hopper. I cemented it to the top of the hopper and the edge of the platform. I then cut a short vertical piece to create the drop into the hopper roof. In my reference photo, with the sand house gone, this filler pipe just kind of hangs on a makeshift support. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do on the bottom end of it on my model, but you will see me explore one option in a few moments. I used plastruck ladders to install the ladder up to the platform and from the platform to the top of the hopper. I used brass wire to create the other pipe that extends vertically from the platform, makes 2 90-degree bends, and drops into the top of the hopper. I don't know exactly what this pipe was for, but it's clearly present, so I modeled it. I glued it in place with CA. I used a sanding stick to clean up any rough edges and to shape the parts of the filler pipe. I had this little shanty on hand from Woodland Scenics. It was part of an electrical substation kit. It isn't right at all for the sand house because it's too small, but I thought that I would use it as a stand-in just for the moment. I drilled a hole in a side wall for the intake pipe and set it in place. I knew I needed slightly more height at the ground level, so I cut a couple of scraps of 40,000 styrene for a sub-base for the legs. I cemented them to the bottom, creating a sort of stair-step cement base look. When it was time to paint, I started by applying a base coat of burnt umber paint with my airbrush. This will create shadows in the recesses of the model, as well as a slight rust look anywhere that this paint shows through the final color. I didn't have a good color on hand to match the prototype, so I mixed an approximate color using yellow ochre and white. The color doesn't match the photo exactly, but it is a close enough approximation and is pretty similar to many items that you find around rail yards. I applied the paint again with my airbrush. I think the model came out looking pretty good. To model the filler hoses, I used black 22 gauge solid wire. I stripped a bit of the insulation from the bottom end and used a silver Sharpie to color the wire to imply a filler nozzle. I glued these hoses to the solid pipes that I had installed earlier with CA. I painted the concrete bases with a light gray craft paint. When that had dried, I used thinned anthracite gray and dark brown to weather the concrete bases, also allowing some of this paint to wick up the crevices in the legs of the model to simulate light rust and grime. Finally, I placed the model on the layout. This stand-in sand house will be replaced with a foundation where the sand house once stood, per my reference photo, but I'll take care of that when I detail the rest of the yard. I think this model makes a pretty good stand-in for this unique old sand tower. So to see how I built Hodge Junction Extension and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. And don't forget that Amazon Pick of the Week in the description down below, as well as other valuable links. And be sure and join me on Fridays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I'll see you on the next video. 10, Lizzie?